In the winter of 1901, a small farming town in eastern Kentucky reported something that investigators at the time described as impossible. It began inside a farmhouse that had stood on the same hillside for nearly 40 years, a quiet place, 2 stories tall, white painted wood slowly fading under Appalachian winters. Nothing about the house seemed unusual, until the morning one of the residents noticed something strange in a mirror. According to the first report filed in the county records, a woman was standing in her bedroom adjusting her hair. Behind her was a mirror mounted on the wall, a simple glass mirror, nothing decorative, nothing unusual. But when she lifted her hand to brush a loose strand of hair from her face, the reflection in the mirror did not move. It remained still. For a moment the woman believed she had imagined it, until the reflection finally lifted its hand slowly. But by then her own hand had already lowered. The movements were no longer synchronized. The reflection was no longer following her, it was reacting. Investigators later described the moment in a single chilling sentence: the mirror appeared to be showing someone else. Within weeks more reports began to surface from inside the same house, different mirrors, different rooms and different reflections. But they all had one thing in common. The reflections were not behaving like reflections. Sometimes they moved late, sometimes they moved first, and sometimes they showed a completely different person. By the time the county sheriff was called to investigate, the family living inside the house had already made a decision. They refused to look at any mirrors, because they believed something inside the house was watching them, and occasionally looking back. The Walker House. Kentucky, 1901. The Walker House stood on a narrow ridge overlooking the valley outside Red Hollow, Kentucky. From the road below, it looked like hundreds of other Appalachian farmhouses built in the late 1800s. White painted wood siding, a steep tin roof that creaked when the wind moved across the hills, a long porch that wrapped around the front of the building. In the spring, wildflowers grew along the fence line. In the winter, fog from the valley drifted slowly past the windows. Nothing about the house seemed unusual, which is exactly why the story that came out of it decades later was so difficult for people to believe. The Walker family had lived there for nearly 10 years by the time the strange events began. Thomas Walker had purchased the property shortly after marrying his wife Eleanor. He was known locally as a quiet but dependable farmer, a tall man with rough hands and a calm voice, the kind of man neighbors trusted without question. Eleanor Walker was described very differently. She was thoughtful, observant, and far more sensitive to the small details of daily life. People in town often said Eleanor noticed things other people ignored. Together they raised 2 boys inside the house. Samuel, the older brother, was 12. Daniel, the youngest, had just turned 9. For years the family lived an ordinary life. The boys helped in the fields. Eleanor managed the house. Thomas worked long hours repairing fences, tending livestock, and hauling supplies into town. Nothing unusual ever happened. At least nothing anyone noticed. But sometime during the winter of 1901, Eleanor Walker began to feel that something inside the house had changed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just subtly enough that she could not explain it. At first it was the mirrors. The house contained several, a small one mounted beside the kitchen basin, another in the upstairs hallway, and a larger mirror framed in dark wood attached to the bedroom wall. These mirrors had hung in the house for years. They had never attracted attention. But Eleanor began to notice something strange when she passed them. The reflections sometimes felt delayed. If she walked quickly past the hallway mirror, she could swear the reflection moved just slightly behind her. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to feel wrong. At first she blamed her imagination. Long winters in the mountains could make anyone restless. But the feeling did not disappear. Instead, it slowly grew stronger. One afternoon Eleanor stood at the kitchen basin washing her hands. The mirror above the sink reflected the small room behind her, the wooden table, the back door, the window looking toward the barn. Everything appeared normal, until she turned to reach for a towel. For a brief moment the reflection in the mirror remained facing forward, as if it had not yet noticed she had moved. The moment passed quickly. When Eleanor looked again, the reflection matched her movements perfectly, but the uneasy feeling stayed with her. She did not tell Thomas about it, at least not at first, because the incident seemed too small to explain, too strange to describe. But several weeks later something happened that forced her to finally speak about it. It was their youngest son who noticed. Daniel Walker had been helping his mother in the kitchen that evening. He stood on a wooden stool beside the basin, washing dirt from his hands after working in the yard. The small mirror hung directly in front of him. Eleanor had just turned toward the stove when Daniel suddenly stopped moving. His hands remained under the water, his eyes fixed on the mirror. At first Eleanor thought he was simply distracted, But then the boy spoke, quietly. "Mom," she turned back toward him. Yes, Daniel did not look away from the mirror. "There's someone behind me." Alina felt a small chill move through her. She stepped closer. The mirror showed Daniel standing alone at the basin. No one stood behind him. "No, there isn't," she said gently. But Daniel shook his head slowly. "There was," he pointed toward the glass. "A man." Alina looked again. The reflection showed only the kitchen, the table, the back door, the window, nothing else. She placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Maybe you just saw your shadow," she said, but Daniel continued staring at the mirror for several seconds longer, as if waiting for something to return. That night Alina covered the mirror above the kitchen basin with a cloth. It was a small decision. One she told herself was unnecessary, but it made her feel slightly more comfortable. She did not realize that the decision would soon become a habit, because over the following weeks the mirrors inside the Walker house began behaving in ways no one in the family could explain, and before long, even Thomas Walker, who really believed in superstition, would begin avoiding his own reflection. Not because the mirrors showed something frightening, but because sometimes they showed someone else, reflections that moved first. Kentucky, 1901. The first person in the Walker house who truly believed something was wrong was Thomas Walker. Until that winter morning, he had dismissed the strange comments his wife and youngest son had made about the mirrors. Children imagined things, and Alina, he believed, had simply spent too many quiet evenings inside the house during a long Appalachian winter. But the incident that changed his mind happened early one morning before sunrise. Thomas stood alone in the upstairs bedroom. The room was cold. Winter light had not yet reached the valley, and the only illumination came from a small oil lamp burning beside the bed. Mounted on the wall opposite the window hung the largest mirror in the house. It had been there when the Walkers first moved in. Heavy wooden frame. Clouded glass slightly worn around the edges. Thomas had used it for years while shaving. That morning was no different. He dipped a straight razor into warm water, lifted his hand to his face and glanced into the mirror. The reflection stared back, tired eyes, rough stubble. Nothing unusual. He raised the razor and began shaving along his jawline. Everything moved exactly as it should. Hand, razor, reflection. Perfectly synchronized, until he blinked. The reflection blinked first. Thomas paused. It was such a small detail that for a moment he believed he had imagined it. People often blinked without noticing. Perhaps the reflection had simply appeared faster than he expected. He leaned closer to the mirror. The lamp beside him flickered slightly. The reflection flickered with it. Everything seemed normal again. Thomas resumed shaving, slowly, carefully. Then he raised his arm to wipe the razor clean on a cloth. But this time something happened that could not be ignored. His arm remained still, yet the reflection lifted its arm. Thomas froze. For several seconds the reflection held the position. Arm raised, razor visible in its hand. Then slowly the reflection lowered the arm, not in the same way Thomas had moved, but differently, almost casually, as if someone else had decided to stop. Thomas stepped backward immediately. The razor dropped onto the wooden floor. The reflection did not react. It simply stared forward, matching him again as though nothing had happened. For several minutes Thomas remained where he stood, breathing slowly. He studied every detail in the mirror, the angle of the lamp, the shadow of the window frame, his own face. Everything matched perfectly, except for the feeling that something inside the glass had just made its own decision. Thomas did not speak about the incident that morning, but later that day he quietly removed the mirror from the wall. He carried it downstairs and placed it face down inside the storage shed behind the barn. When Alina asked why he had done it, Thomas offered a simple explanation. "The frame's cracked," he said. "I'll fix it later." But Alina could tell from his voice that something had frightened him, and she did not ask further questions. For several days afterward the house felt calmer. With the large bedroom mirror removed, the strange feeling inside the upstairs room seemed to fade. Life returned to normal, or at least it appeared to. But the Walker house still contained other mirrors, and eventually they began behaving strangely as well. The next incident involved the hallway mirror, a narrow glass frame hanging between the two upstairs bedrooms. One evening Samuel Walker was walking down the hall carrying a lantern. He paused briefly beside the mirror to adjust the wick. As the flame brightened, the hallway filled with warm light. Samuel glanced into the mirror and immediately felt something was wrong. At first he could not explain why. Then he realized what had caught his attention. The reflection in the mirror was standing slightly closer to the glass than he was, just barely, but enough that the proportions did not match. Samuel stepped back. The reflection remained still. Then it stepped back as well, perfectly matching him again. Samuel stared at the mirror for a long time. Finally he turned away and continued walking toward his bedroom. But that night, before going to sleep, He quietly covered the hallway mirror with a cloth, just as his mother had done with the kitchen mirror weeks earlier. Soon every mirror inside the Walker house would be covered, except one, because the house contained a mirror that could not easily be removed. A mirror fixed directly into the wall of the upstairs bedroom. And it was that mirror, the largest in the house, that would produce the most disturbing reflection anyone in the Walker family had ever seen. But the event that forced the family to call the sheriff had not happened yet. At least not officially. Because the youngest member of the family had already seen something the others had not. Daniel Walker had begun avoiding mirrors entirely. Not because of what they showed, but because of what they sometimes showed after he had already walked away. He claimed the reflections inside the glass did not always leave when he did. Sometimes they remained, watching the empty room. The Stranger in the Glass. Kentucky, 1901. By the time the Walker family covered most of the mirrors in the house, the strange incidents had already begun to change the atmosphere inside the building. Rooms that once felt ordinary now felt uneasy. The upstairs hallway was the worst. Even during daylight it seemed dim. Shadows gathered near the staircase, and the air carried a quiet tension that no one in the family could properly explain. But the most disturbing moment came late one evening, when Elena Walker passed the hallway mirror alone. The cloth covering had slipped, just slightly, enough to expose a thin strip of glass along the side of the frame. Elena noticed the gap immediately. She stepped toward the mirror to fix it. For a moment she hesitated. She had not looked directly into that mirror for several days. But curiosity made her glance into the exposed strip of glass. What she saw stopped her completely. At first the reflection looked normal, the hallway behind her, the wooden railing of the staircase, the faint light from a lamp downstairs, and herself, standing there. But something about the reflection felt wrong. Not the position, not the lighting, the expression. The woman inside the mirror was smiling. Elena was not. For several seconds she remained frozen, staring into the narrow strip of glass. The reflection continued smiling calmly. Then slowly the woman in the mirror tilted her head. Elena did not move. The reflection continued watching her. Then the smile disappeared, and the face changed. It did not shift dramatically. The features remained similar, but something about the reflection was no longer Elena. The eyes looked older, tired. The mouth carried a faint scar Elena had never had, and the expression was colder, almost curious. Elena stepped backward instantly and pulled the cloth tightly across the mirror. Her hands trembled as she secured the fabric. Thomas came upstairs later that night. He found her sitting quietly at the edge of the bed. She did not explain everything she had seen. Only enough to make him understand one thing clearly. The mirrors were no longer showing the people standing in front of them. Thomas listened carefully. For several minutes he said nothing. Then he stood and walked into the hallway. He stopped in front of the covered mirror. Without hesitation he pulled the cloth aside. The glass reflected the empty hallway. Thomas looked at his own reflection carefully. Nothing unusual. He leaned closer, still nothing. Finally he stepped back. Just glass, he said. But as he turned away, Elena spoke quietly from the bedroom doorway. Look again. Thomas stopped. He slowly turned back toward the mirror, and that was when he noticed something he had missed. The reflection inside the mirror was still facing him, even though he had already turned his body toward the bedroom. For a moment, the reflection remained there, looking directly at him. Then it slowly turned as well, matching his movement again. Thomas pulled the cloth back over the mirror immediately. That night the Walker family made a decision. From that moment forward no one in the house would look into any mirror again. All of them would remain covered. Every single one. But even covered mirrors can reflect light, and sometimes reflections can still appear. The next incident happened several nights later. It was Daniel who noticed first. The boy woke suddenly in the middle of the night. The house was silent. Moonlight drifted through the window, casting pale shapes across the wooden floor. Daniel sat up in bed and looked toward the far wall of the bedroom. That was where the largest mirror in the house remained fixed, covered with a heavy blanket. But something about it looked strange. The blanket was moving, not dramatically, just gently, as if someone behind it had shifted. Daniel climbed out of bed slowly. He stepped toward the mirror. The blanket continued moving slightly, then it stopped. For a moment the room was completely still. Daniel reached out and pulled the cloth away. What he saw inside the mirror was not his reflection. The glass showed the same bedroom, the same window, the same moonlight. But the boy standing inside the reflection was not Daniel. The child in the mirror was older, perhaps 12 or 13. His hair was darker, his face thinner, and he was standing closer to the mirror than Daniel was. The strange boy inside the reflection slowly raised his hand, not in greeting, but as if he were touching the inside of the glass. Daniel stepped backward. The reflection did not move, it continued staring at him calmly. Then the boy inside the mirror spoke, but no sound came from the glass. Daniel screamed. The entire house woke instantly. Thomas rushed into the bedroom first. Elena followed seconds later. They found Daniel standing against the far wall pointing toward the uncovered mirror. But when they looked at the glass, the reflection showed nothing unusual. Just Daniel. And the frightened expressions of his parents standing behind him. Thomas covered the mirror again. The cloth trembled slightly as he tied it tightly around the frame. For several minutes no one spoke. Finally Daniel whispered something that neither parent could easily dismiss. "He wasn't me." Thomas asked him who he meant. Daniel pointed toward the mirror. The boy inside. The sheriff's investigation. Kentucky, 1901. By early spring, word about the Walker house had quietly begun to circulate through the town of Red Hollow. At first the rumors were vague. People spoke about strange noises, covered mirrors, a frightened child. But the story grew more unsettling each time it was repeated. Eventually the reports reached the office of Sheriff William Carta, the county's only law officer. Carta was not a man who believed in superstition. He had investigated theft, land disputes, and even the occasional violent crime. But stories about haunted reflections were not something he had ever encountered before. Still, the Walker family had lived in the county for years. They were known to be honest people. And when Thomas Walker finally rode into town one morning asking for help, Carter agreed to visit the house himself. The sheriff arrived at the Walker property late that afternoon. The road leading to the farmhouse wound through a narrow stretch of forest before climbing the ridge where the house stood. From a distance the building looked quiet, perfectly ordinary. No broken windows, no signs of damage, just an aging farmhouse standing alone against the hills. Thomas Walker greeted the sheriff at the gate. The farmer looked tired. His eyes carried the expression of someone who had not slept well for several nights. "Thank you for coming," Thomas said quietly. Carta nodded. "Let's take a look." They walked toward the house together. The porch boards creaked under their boots as they stepped inside. The interior of the Walker home smelled faintly of wood smoke and lamp oil. Everything appeared normal. The kitchen table was clean. The chairs neatly arranged. The windows opened slightly to allow fresh air into the rooms. But one detail immediately caught the sheriff's attention. Every mirror inside the house had been covered. Heavy cloths hung over the frames, some tied tightly with rope, others pinned in place. Carta paused beside the first one he saw. "Why cover them?" he asked. Thomas hesitated before answering. "Because they don't always show the right person." Carta studied the cloth covering the mirror, then slowly removed it. The mirror beneath looked completely ordinary. He examined the frame, checked the glass, tapped gently against the wall behind it. Nothing unusual. "Just a mirror," he said, but Thomas shook his head slightly. "They are not always like that." Carta continued walking through the house. Every mirror looked the same, normal, unremarkable. Finally, he climbed the staircase to the second floor. At the end of the hallway stood the largest mirror in the house. The one Daniel had screamed about. A thick blanket covered the frame. Unlike the others, this mirror had been built directly into the wall. Carta removed the blanket slowly. The glass revealed the hallway behind him, the staircase, the dim evening light coming through the window, and Thomas Walker standing several feet away. The sheriff studied the reflection carefully. Nothing unusual. He stepped closer. Still nothing. But as he leaned forward to examine the surface of the glass, he noticed something subtle. The reflection of Thomas Walker behind him appeared slightly darker than it should have been. Not dramatically. Just enough to make the sheriff narrow his eyes. Carta turned around. Thomas stood exactly where the reflection showed him. Same posture, same expression. But when the sheriff turned back toward the mirror, the reflection of Thomas was no longer there. The hallway appeared empty. The sheriff frowned. He glanced over his shoulder again. Thomas remained standing behind him. "Did you move?" Carter asked. No. Carta looked back at the mirror. Now the reflection of Thomas had returned. Standing exactly where he should be. For a moment Carter remained silent. He stepped back from the glass. "Probably just the lighting," he said. But his voice carried less certainty than before. They continued examining the house for nearly an hour. The sheriff checked windows, doors, the attic, even the crawlspace beneath the floorboards. Nothing suggested that anyone else had been entering the house. Nothing suggested trickery. Eventually evening began to settle across the valley. The light inside the hallway dimmed. Carta prepared to leave. But before he stepped outside, he returned to the upstairs mirror one last time. He wanted to confirm what he had seen earlier. The blanket still hung beside the frame. The mirror remained uncovered. Carta stood directly in front of it. For several seconds he watched his own reflection. Everything appeared normal until something moved behind him. The sheriff turned quickly. The hallway was empty. When he looked back toward the mirror, his reflection was still facing forward. Watching the glass, even though he had already turned around, the reflection slowly turned its head, matching him again. Kata covered the mirror immediately. He did not speak about what he had seen, at least not to the Walker family. But later that night, when he returned to town, he wrote a note in his personal report, a sentence investigators would later find deeply unsettling. He wrote, "The mirrors behave as though they are waiting for something to happen." And in the months that followed, something inside the Walker house would finally reveal itself. But by then the family had already decided they could not remain there any longer. The room without mirrors. Kentucky, 1901. After the sheriff's visit, the Walker family reached a decision that none of them had imagined making when they first moved into the house. Every mirror would be removed, not covered. Not turned toward the wall, removed completely. Thomas Walker began the work the very next morning. He started with the small mirrors first, the ones hanging in bedrooms and above the wash basins. Each frame was taken down carefully. The nails were pulled from the walls, the glass wrapped in cloth. By noon, a stack of mirrors leaned against the far wall of the barn outside. Alina stood in the doorway watching. The glass caught faint sunlight, reflecting narrow flashes across the wooden floor. Even outside the house, the reflections felt unsettling. Daniel refused to look at them. "Are we throwing them away?" he asked. Thomas hesitated. "No," he said finally, "just moving them." But one mirror remained inside the house, the large one fixed into the wall at the end of the upstairs hallway. The one the sheriff had examined. Thomas had tried to remove it earlier that morning, but the mirror was not like the others. Its frame was embedded into the wall itself. The glass was thick and heavy, and behind it, hidden beneath the wooden paneling, the mirror appeared to be anchored into the structure of the house. Thomas pried carefully at the edges with a crowbar. The frame did not move. He tried again with greater force, still nothing. It was as though the mirror had been built into the house long before the Walkers had ever arrived. Eventually Thomas stopped trying. That evening the family made a new plan. They would avoid the hallway entirely. No one would walk past the mirror after dark. Daniel would sleep downstairs. Alina agreed. For several nights the arrangement seemed to work. The house became quiet again. Without the smaller mirrors, something about the rooms felt, less watchful. But the hallway remained different. Even when no one walked there, the mirror seemed to affect the air around it. The upstairs landing always felt colder. The light from the window never reached the glass completely. And at night, when the wind moved through the valley outside, faint creaking sounds echoed along the wooden floorboards. The first serious incident happened late one evening. Thomas had fallen asleep in the chair beside the fireplace. Alina was reading near the kitchen table. Daniel had already gone to bed. The house remained silent, until a sound came from upstairs. Not loud, not sudden, just a faint shift, like wood moving slowly under pressure. Alina looked toward the staircase. "Did you hear that?" she asked quietly. Thomas opened his eyes. For several seconds both of them listened. Nothing. The house returned to silence. Thomas stood up. "Ill check." Alina grabbed his arm. "Don't." But Thomas had already started climbing the stairs. Each step creaked softly beneath his weight. The hallway above looked exactly the same as we had, dim, still. The mirror remained at the far end. The blanket they had placed over it days earlier still hung in place. Thomas stepped closer. The blanket moved slightly, not much. Just enough to suggest something behind it had shifted. Thomas froze. For several seconds he simply watched. Then slowly he reached forward and pulled the blanket away. The mirror revealed the hallway behind him, the staircase, the faint light from the room downstairs, and Thomas Walker standing in front of the glass. But something else stood there too. Another figure appeared behind his reflection. Thomas turned around instantly. The hallway was empty. When he looked back toward the mirror, the second figure had disappeared. Only his own reflection remained. But something about it felt wrong. The reflection did not blink. Thomas stared at the glass, carefully. Seconds passed, still no blinking. Then slowly the reflection smiled. Thomas stepped backward. The reflection remained smiling, even though Thomas himself had not. The smile widened slightly. Then the reflection leaned forward, closer to the glass, closer than Thomas had moved. Thomas pulled the blanket over the mirror immediately. His hands shook as he tied the cloth tightly around the frame. When he returned downstairs, Alina could see immediately that something had changed. "What happened?" she asked. Thomas looked toward the staircase before answering. "The mirror isn't just showing reflections," he said quietly. "It's showing something else." Alina felt a chill run through her. "What do you mean?" Thomas hesitated. "I think the mirror is showing people who aren't in the house." Neither of them slept that night. The next morning Thomas boarded up the hallway entrance completely. Wooden planks sealed the passage leading to the mirror. From that moment forward, the upstairs hallway no longer existed as part of the house. But sometimes, late at night, Alina still heard something behind those boards, a faint sound, almost like breathing, and occasionally a quiet tapping, as if someone on the other side of the wall was trying to get out the house before the Walkers. For several weeks after the hallway was sealed, the Walker house grew quieter than it had been in months. The boards Thomas nailed across the upstairs passage remained untouched. No one went near them. No one spoke about the mirror anymore. But silence does not erase questions. And the longer the family remained inside the house, the more Thomas began wondering about something he had never considered before. Who built the house in the first place? When the Walkers purchased the property 2 years earlier, the sale had seemed simple. The farmhouse was old but well maintained, the land was fertile, and the price had been surprisingly low. At the time, Thomas had assumed the previous owners simply wanted to move closer to town. Now he was no longer certain. One morning he saddled his horse and rode into Red Hollow. His destination was the county courthouse. The building sat near the center of town, its tall wooden doors worn smooth from decades of use. Inside, shelves of old ledgers lined the walls, property records, tax documents, land ownership lists dating back several generations. The clerk, an older man named Mr. Holloway, helped Thomas search through the archives. After nearly an hour, they located the original record for the Walker property. The house had been built in 1867, but the name listed on the original construction permit surprised Thomas. The builder was not a farmer nor a carpenter. It belonged to a man named Dr. Elias Mercer. Thomas had never heard the name before. Who was he? Thomas asked. Holloway leaned back in his chair thoughtfully. Mercer, he murmured. Doctor, I think. Lived here many years ago. What kind of doctor? Holloway shrugged slightly. Depends who you ask. Thomas waited. The clerk lowered his voice slightly. Some folks said Mercer studied unusual things. Unusual how? Holloway glanced toward the hallway outside the office before answering. He believed reflections could reveal truths people tried to hide. Thomas felt a chill move through his chest. What does that mean? Holloway reached toward another shelf and pulled down a thinner ledger. He opened it carefully. Inside were several handwritten notes attached to the Mercer property record. Most were short, but one entry stood out clearly. The note had been written nearly 30 years earlier. It read, house abandoned after disturbances reported by occupants. Mirrors inside property to remain untouched. Thomas looked up. What disturbances? Holloway shook his head slowly. No one ever wrote that part down. The clerk closed the book. But people in town used to say Mercer believed mirrors were not just glass. Thomas felt the unease growing stronger. What did he think they were? Holloway answered quietly. Doors. The word hung in the room for several seconds. Thomas closed the ledger. Did anyone ever live there, after Mercer? Only one family, Holloway said. They stayed less than 6 months. And why did they leave? Holloway did not answer immediately. Finally he spoke. They said the mirrors inside the house showed things that hadn't happened yet. Thomas returned home late that afternoon. The sun was already sinking behind the hills when he reached the property. From the outside, the farmhouse looked exactly the same as always, calm. Still. But now Thomas saw it differently. The building no longer felt like a home. It felt like a structure built for a purpose. Inside, Alina waited near the kitchen table. Did you find anything? She asked. Thomas nodded slowly. The house wasn't built as a farmhouse. Alina frowned. Then why was it built? Thomas hesitated. Finally he said the one thing he could not ignore. The man who built it believed mirrors were doors. Alina stared at him. Doors to what? Thomas looked toward the staircase. Toward the boards that sealed the hallway above. I'm not sure, he said quietly. But I think the mirror upstairs was meant to open something. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The house remained silent around them. Then suddenly a sound came from the second floor. Not loud, just a faint shift behind the wooden boards, followed by a slow scratching noise. Thomas and Alina both looked toward the staircase. The scratching continued. 3 soft taps against the boards, then silence again. Alina whispered something Thomas had been trying not to think about. What if the door already opened? Thomas did not answer, because deep inside he already suspected something worse. The mirror had never opened. It had always been open. And whatever lived inside it had simply been waiting for someone to look. The reflection that stepped out. Kentucky, 1901. After Thomas Walker returned from the courthouse, the atmosphere inside the house changed in a way that none of them could explain. Before that day, the mirrors had felt unsettling, strange, but still distant. Now they felt intentional, as if the house itself had been designed to guide the family toward a single discovery. And the sealed hallway upstairs had become the center of that quiet pressure. For 3 nights nothing happened. The boards Thomas nailed across the hallway remained untouched. No sounds, no tapping. The house stayed completely still. But on the fourth night, the silence finally broke. It began shortly after midnight. Thomas woke suddenly, he did not know why. The bedroom remained dark except for faint moonlight passing through the window. Alina slept beside him. The house seemed quiet, then he heard it, a slow movement from the second floor, wood creaking. Soft pressure, against the boards that sealed the hallway. Thomas sat up in bed. For several seconds he listened carefully. The sound came again, not scratching this time. Something heavier, like footsteps. Walking slowly behind the boards, Thomas stood and stepped into the hallway. The staircase leading upstairs disappeared into darkness. But the sound continued, one step. Then another, measured. Calm as if someone were pacing behind the wooden barrier, Alina appeared behind him. "You hear it too," she whispered. Thomas nodded. Neither of them spoke again. They both knew what the sound meant. Something was moving inside the sealed hallway. Something that should not have been there. Thomas grabbed the lantern from the table and lit it quickly. The flame flickered softly as he began climbing the stairs. Each step creaked under his weight. The sound behind the boards stopped immediately. The hallway above remained sealed exactly as he had left it. Wooden planks, stretched across the entrance. Nails still firmly in place, nothing appeared disturbed. For several seconds Thomas simply stood there, holding the lantern toward the barrier. Then something changed. The light from the lantern touched the cracks between the boards, and through those narrow gaps Thomas saw movement. Not outside the hallway, inside it. Something was standing in front of the mirror. Thomas slowly leaned closer to the boards. The lantern light reached through the cracks just enough to reveal the glass beyond. The mirror no longer showed the hallway, it showed a room that did not exist inside the house, dark, empty. And inside that reflection someone was standing. The figure looked like Thomas, same height, same clothes, same face. But the expression was wrong. The reflection was smiling calmly. Thomas stepped backward immediately. The reflection did not move, it continued standing in the mirror watching, then slowly the figure, inside the glass, began walking forward. Closer to the mirror, closer to the barrier, closer to the cracks between the boards. Thomas felt his chest tighten. Alina stepped beside him. "What is it?" she whispered. Thomas pointed toward the narrow gap. Alina leaned forward and saw the same thing. The reflection had reached the surface of the mirror, its hand pressed gently against the glass. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the surface of the mirror changed, the glass rippled. Like water disturbed by a small stone, the reflection pushed forward slightly. And the hand moved through the glass, not as a reflection, as something real. Alina gasped. Thomas grabbed her arm and pulled her back down the stairs. Neither of them stopped moving until they reached the front door. They stepped outside into the cold night air. Behind them the house remained silent. But the lantern light shining through the upstairs window revealed something neither of them had expected to see: a figure standing in the hallway, watching them. The shape looked exactly like Thomas Walker. But Thomas was standing beside Alina in the yard. For several seconds the figure inside the house remained still. Then it slowly turned away from the window and disappeared deeper into the hallway. The Walker family never entered the house again after that night. Within a week they left the property entirely. The farmhouse remained empty for years. Eventually it was abandoned completely. But people who later passed along the old road sometimes reported seeing something strange through the upstairs window. A figure standing inside the hallway, perfectly still, watching the outside world. And sometimes on quiet nights travelers claimed they saw another figure standing in the yard, looking back at the house. The things that watch back. The Walker family never returned to the house. Within a month the property stood empty. The windows were boarded, the doors were sealed. And the upstairs hallway where the mirror remained was left exactly as it had been that final night. Local records show the house changed owners several times over the next 20 years. But something strange appeared in each report. No family stayed longer than a few months, and almost every record included the same quiet complaint. Something was wrong with the mirrors. Some people claimed the reflections moved too slowly. Others said the reflections moved too soon. A few insisted they had seen strangers inside the glass, people who were not standing in the room. Eventually the mirrors were removed from most of the house, all except one. The large mirror built into the upstairs hallway, the one no carpenter could remove, the one Dr. Elias Mercer installed when the house was first built in the late 1800s. The mirror that Mercer once described in his private notes as a window that does not reflect the present. Those notes were discovered decades later in a small medical journal stored in the county archives. Most of the pages were damaged, but one passage remained clear. Mercer had written, "Every mirror shows the world behind us, but some mirrors show the world beside us." No one knows exactly what he meant. The Walker house still stands today, weathered, silent, forgotten by most people passing through the hills of Kentucky. The upstairs hallway remains sealed, the mirror still fixed inside the wall, and every few years someone curious enough tries to reopen that passage. But according to the last report filed with the county in the early 1920s, the boards covering the hallway were never nailed from the outside. They were nailed from the inside, as if someone standing inside the hallway was trying to keep something out, or perhaps trying to keep something in. And sometimes late at night travelers on the old road say they see movement in the upstairs window. Not a ghost, not a shadow. Just a man standing very still in the hallway, watching the road, watching the people who pass the house, waiting. Because if Dr. Mercer was right, the mirror in that hallway was never meant to reflect the people in the room. It was meant to reflect the people who hadn't arrived yet. And somewhere on the other side of that glass there may still be a reflection, waiting for its chance to step out.